Better Call Saul is a show filled to the brim with amazing episodes. Often when people pick out their favorites, the ones that come up are Season 2, Episode 10, Click, Season 3, Episode 5, Chicanery, or perhaps the show's finale, Season 6, Episode 13, Saul Gone. Now, some of you may expect me to do the "my favorite episode is actually this underrated gem that no one has noticed before this video" thing that is so pervasive on YouTube. However, the fact is that the episode I've chosen for this video essay has actually been recognized as one of the best episodes, if not the best episode of Better Call Saul. So, a hidden gem it is not. The episode in question is Season 5, Episode 8, titled Bagman. In this video, I will analyze why this episode is so great. To do that, I'll explain what kinds of narrative threads the show is weaving even before Bagman, and how the episode brings many of these different elements to a close, depicting how the events of this episode permanently change Jimmy McGill. Obviously, there will be spoilers for all of Better Call Saul, and I do have to discuss the preceding show Breaking Bad as well, so let's mark the entirety of those two shows with a spoiler warning. With that said, let's get into it.
Once you get there, you're gonna see a well. It's really old, broken down.
What does this well look like?
It looks like a well. It's the only one out there.
The basis of Better Call Saul is the expectation that at some point our protagonist Jimmy McGill will become the character we know him as from Breaking Bad, that being Saul Goodman. It's a 6-season long character arc in which Jimmy's naivete and moral judgments are slowly chipped away until the only thing left is the greedy, crooked lawyer that we know him as. One of the reasons why Bagman sticks out as the best episode of Better Call Saul is because it marks a significant step in Jimmy's journey to become Saul. So let's set the stage for Bagman. Prior to the events of this episode, Jimmy has legally changed his name to Saul Goodman. He has used numerous dubious law strategies to get his way, but he hasn't necessarily crossed into being a full-on crooked lawyer. During Bagman and Season 5 in general, Jimmy is in a period of transition. He lost his law license and therefore he has been doing odd jobs and all sorts of criminal activities for a year. That's basically Season 4. Using connections that he made during that off year, he now strives to become a criminal defense lawyer. However, Jimmy's version of practicing the law is very different from the way, for example, Jimmy's now wife Kim Wexler practices. Jimmy is technically defending those who wouldn't have a good legal counsel otherwise, but he does so because of greed. For example, at one point Jimmy admits that he has 45 different cases at the same time.
Hey, you're doing great. I'm gonna be doing great. I got 45 clients.
45? How are you gonna handle all that?
I got a system, but can we just look?
Kim Wexler, on the other hand, actually cares about her clients and does her best to represent them in court. The ending of Season 5 Episode 3 and the beginning of Season 5 Episode 4 illustrate this difference in character perfectly. At the end of Episode 3, Jimmy and Kim throw glass bottles from their balcony because Kim is frustrated with her job. At the beginning of the next episode, the two go to work and notice the glass shards littered in their driveway. Jimmy's reaction is that someone will eventually come and take care of it, and therefore they shouldn't bother with the cleanup. Despite Jimmy's comments, Kim stays behind and cleans up the mess. The reason I bring this up is because Better Call Saul's method of showing Jimmy's eventual moral unraveling ties into how Kim sees Jimmy. Kim has a strong moral backbone that Jimmy seems to lack, at least in some cases. It's a bit complicated. That is not to say that Jimmy is without a conscience though. In Season 5 Episode 7, for example, while representing Lalo Salamanca in a murder case, we can clearly see Jimmy's more sympathetic side come out as he stares at the family of Fred Wallen, the man Lalo Salamanca killed during the previous season. In essence, during the 5th season of the show, Jimmy has now realized that even though he will never be on the same level as his brother as a lawyer, he can still be a very skilled crooked lawyer. As he says during the first episode of the season,
Jimmy McGill, the lawyer, is always gonna be Chuck McGill's loser brother. I'm done with that. That name is burned.
he can live in his brother's shadow, which is also why he will later reject Howard Hamlin's job offer, even though Jimmy himself says that it is because he is quote-unquote above it. Jimmy's current state of mind is very important to acknowledge here because his resolve to become a crooked lawyer will be tested during the events of Bagman. Jimmy has done some very dubious things leading up to Bagman, but this will be the first time that he faces cartel violence. He has faced the threat of violence from Tuco Salamanca, but nothing like in this episode. Jimmy has already worked with Nacho Varga and Lalo Salamanca to the extent that when Lalo is put on trial, Jimmy is the one summoned for his legal counsel. The key difference is, however, that Jimmy's prior jobs with Nacho and Lalo were strictly on his side of the aisle. In Bagman, Jimmy steps into the side of the show that we, the audience, have been experiencing through Mike Ehrmantraut's Lalo and Nacho, the more violent criminal underbelly of Albuquerque and Mexico. At the beginning of Bagman, Jimmy is given the task of retrieving $7 million to post Lalo's bail so that he can return to Mexico without being tried in the US. Lalo gives this task to Jimmy because he doesn't fully trust Nacho with $7 million. Furthermore, he can't enlist help from his cousins as they would draw too much suspicion. Jimmy hesitates for a moment but later agrees to transport the bail money. He accepts the task after he bargains a $100,000 payout for himself. The payout is a large motivating factor for Jimmy, but there's also the added benefit of becoming a friend of the cartel. As was the case with Jimmy looking at the family of Fred Wallen, he does know that this is very bad, but he has chosen to push those feelings aside for the possibility of making a whole ton of money working for the cartel. That is to say, I think Jimmy himself knows that getting the bail money for Lalo is a fundamentally unjust action, but the draw of the money and status that it will garner him will be worth it in the long run. Whether Jimmy knows how dangerous this could potentially be is up to debate. My personal interpretation is that Jimmy realizes the danger on some level, but purposefully chooses to downplay it because he wants the cartel connection so bad. Now, this would be an interesting concept in itself, but the writers of Better Call Saul knew that this wouldn't be enough. We already know that Jimmy will eventually become Saul Goodman, so him taking on this dangerous but very lucrative job is something that we can already expect from him. What the audience, however, might not have expected is how this affects Jimmy's relationship with his wife, Kim. This dynamic will come to question throughout the events of Bagman. So to recap, not only is Jimmy venturing into a new dangerous territory, but we also see how it can affect his personal life outside the law. And make no mistake, Jimmy choosing to take this job will result in many bad events down the line. With that said, let's move on to the meat of the episode.
It's insane.
It's just little old me and my little old Suzuki Esteem, and there has never been more than $50 in an Esteem in the history of Esteem, so no one's gonna look at me twice.
Another reason why Bagman is incredible is because it brings in most of the plot threads the show has been spinning during the 5th season. I wouldn't call it the climax of these arcs, but it is impressive how much groundwork the show has done to lead up to this one episode. Not only is this a major opportunity for Jimmy, but it is also something that Gus and Mike have been cooking up all season. Lalo Salamanca has been a menace on the northern side of the border, and thus Gus wants him to return to Mexico. However, Gus can't eliminate Lalo directly as the other cartel leaders would immediately suspect him. Therefore, he enlists help from Lalo's right-hand man, Nacho, by blackmailing him. So big picture, this feud is between Gus and Lalo. Gus has Mike working for him and Nacho under his thumb. Lalo has his cousins and Nacho, although he doesn't know that Nacho is working against him. And then there's Jimmy, who only knows he's working for Lalo, but he also has the support of Gus and Mike to help him transport the money so that Lalo can go back to Mexico and be out of Gustavo's hair. Unbeknownst to every party involved and the audience, Juan Bolsa has also dispatched a group of cartel thugs to kill Jimmy and retrieve the money so that Lalo doesn't get out of jail. It's like a chess game, and you know what the best part is? It all feels completely organic. Jimmy is about to walk into a major cartel conflict, and he has no idea. The cold open of Bagman establishes the center of the conflict. The Salamanca twins arrive at the stash house where they place $7 million into 2 duffel bags. As they leave, the keeper of the stash house calls a mysterious third party. Later on, we find out that they must be informing Bolsa that $7 million are about to be moved to post Lalo's bail. Fun fact, in a Variety interview, Vince Gilligan mentioned that Mark Hansen, our prop master, figured out that each bag would weigh 75 pounds for a total of 150 if they were real. That's how much 7 million in hundreds actually weighs, believe it or not. Bob wanted them pretty heavy, but not that heavy. And I think that as the days progressed, the prop bags got a little lighter and a little lighter, because it was rough. The 2 duffel bags containing $7 million come into Jimmy's possession. He nonchalantly places them into his trunk. As expected by the audience, but not Jimmy, a truck soon begins to follow him, and Jimmy is stopped. The thugs take the money from the trunk and point a gun at Jimmy. Just as they're about to kill him, Mike takes out the thugs from a long distance. One thug, however, manages to escape in a car. This is where we should note how Better Call Saul can't really resort to cheap tricks to build tension in most scenes. As Better Call Saul is a prequel to Breaking Bad, we already know that Jimmy isn't going to be game ended here. In fact, we know that he won't get any sort of permanent, visible scarring or something like that, because Saul Goodman doesn't have any in Breaking Bad. Therefore, the scene focuses on building tension through a few different things. Number 1, how will Jimmy escape this situation? And number 2, how will this incident impact him moving forward? The answer to the first question is pretty simple. Jimmy isn't a killer, so he doesn't disarm the thugs and shoot them. Jimmy also isn't able to speak himself out of this situation like he does in most other episodes of Better Call Saul. Therefore, an outside force has to save him. Mike was already tracking Jimmy, and he wants the money delivered because it plays into the strategy that he and Gus have formulated for getting rid of Lalo. This also helps with the believability of the scene. Mike didn't randomly stumble into saving Jimmy. He was ordered there because, unbeknownst to Jimmy, he actually has people helping him in his task of delivering the money. It also makes sense that it's Mike and not some other goon from Gustavo's organization. Once again, it feels organic and true to character. It doesn't feel like they wanted to just shoehorn Mike into this episode. What's more interesting is the second question. How will this incident affect Jimmy? What we know of Jimmy at this point in the story is that he is strictly against violence. Just look back at the way he reacted to Tuco Salamanca almost killing the Skater twins in the first season of Better Call Saul. He bargains with Tuco to let them live, even at the risk of his own life. Then consider what kind of a character Saul Goodman is in Breaking Bad. The first time that Walt and Jesse speak to him about getting Badger out of jail, Saul's suggestion is just to game end Badger.
Okay, so if a prison shanking is completely off the table, and we're sure of that? No shanking!
Considering these aspects, Jimmy's reaction to this violence is very interesting. We've grown accustomed to Jimmy or Saul consistently running his mouth in almost every scene that he is in. Instead here, after the firefights, we see Jimmy totally silent. Jimmy is clearly in shock, and it's striking to see this character change so drastically. This moment will deeply affect Jimmy, as reflected in the next episode.
You said this goes away, so what's the time frame on that?
It should also be noted that this event isn't what transforms Jimmy into the nonchalant about murder Saul Goodman. He is just as shocked when Lalo Salamanca kills Howard Hamlin in Season 6, Episode 7. But I'd argue that this is a major step in the journey towards becoming Saul Goodman. Unlike Jimmy, Saul knows that this is the price of dealing with the cartel. Anyway, Jimmy and Mike get into Jimmy's Suzuki Esteem and start driving. After a while, the car breaks down as the alternator has been shot. Mike removes the license plate and the gas cap from the Esteem. Only upon rewatching Season 3, I realized that Mike takes the gas cap because that's where Gus bugged him. So maybe Gus has also had Jimmy bugged somewhere along the way. It's a very neat, subtle detail. To cover their tracks, Jimmy and Mike push the Esteem into a ditch. Just before that though, Jimmy retrieves his world's second best lawyer again coffee mug from the car. And this is a good time to take a little sidebar and discuss the symbolic value of these items.
Son of a...
One of the most consistent storytelling tools in the Gilligan-verse is the use of props as motifs. It's the pink teddy bear in the second season of Breaking Bad and its eyeball in the following seasons. It's the colors that Walt wears throughout Breaking Bad to reflect his state of mind. Better Call Saul also uses objects to reflect Jimmy's transition into Saul. Every episode of Better Call Saul begins with an opening that highlights one of the items that the audience knows belongs to Saul Goodman. It's a great way of reminding the audience that this is where we are headed. Jimmy's transformation into Saul is also highlighted by incremental steps like buying flamboyant suits or by Jimmy literally changing his name to Saul Goodman. Another easy example is Jimmy wearing Marco's ring, which represents Jimmy's allure to stay as a conman instead of an honest lawyer. Even the use of smoke on the water implies Jimmy's crooked ways, as it appears often when Jimmy is in the process of doing something unethical.
Hey, how'd it go?
Bagman marks a transitional period for Jimmy not only because he faces violence for the first time, but also because two of the most well-known motifs tied to him are destroyed. The first prop that the episode utilizes is Jimmy's signature car, the Suzuki Esteem. This is the car that Jimmy has been driving since episode 1 of the show. As I mentioned already, the car is shot in the firefight and eventually rolled into a ditch. Jimmy survives just as we expected, but a part of him is left in the desert. From the audience's perspective, it almost feels like the fun Jimmy makes commercials and acts like a clown part of the show is over. And to a certain extent, that is exactly what ends up happening. At the risk of overanalyzing this Suzuki Esteem, I think that this moment is supposed to indicate to the audience that this is something much more dangerous than what Jimmy has been doing up until this point in the show. The Suzuki Esteem has survived every single scam up until this point. It's a clever way of letting the audience know that Saul has now stepped into territory that he might not be as prepared for as he thinks. It also makes way for the white 1997 Cadillac DeVille with the license plate Lawyer Up, which we see in Breaking Bad. In this sense, the Suzuki Esteem marks another step in Jimmy becoming Saul. Another item that is given special interest is the world's second best lawyer again coffee mug. This item is given to Jimmy during the first episode of the 5th season after Jimmy gets reinstated as a lawyer, but the significance of the coffee mug goes back much earlier. This coffee mug is a motif used to signify Jimmy's status as a lawyer. For example, during the 2nd season when Jimmy gets a cushy job with a nice car at Davis and Maine, he tries to fit the coffee mug into the cup holder of the car, but it doesn't fit, signifying that while the job is very nice and comfortable, Jimmy doesn't fit into it. Craig Elvey from Screen Rant proposes that the mug signifies Jimmy's efforts to become a legit lawyer instead of a crooked one. If we go with the notion that the coffee mug represents Jimmy's status as a lawyer, then it is very fitting that in an episode where Jimmy embarks upon the most dangerous task so far and almost gets shot because of it, the coffee mug instead receives a bullet. Along with the destruction of Jimmy's car, it signifies that Jimmy was very near to losing his life. But it doesn't end there. Both the car and the coffee mug later come into play in the show. The car's significance is pretty clear from the show even without delving into a thorough analysis, so I won't spend too much time on it here. In a nutshell, Lalo finds the car riddled with bullet holes, which makes him suspicious about Jimmy's retelling of the events of Bagman. This leads Lalo to later visit Jimmy and Kim's apartments and threaten them. In the 6th season, Lalo returns a second time, but that's not relevant for this essay. What is more interesting is the coffee mug with the bullet hole in it. Jimmy brings the coffee mug back with him after the ordeal and places it into a bag with the $100K that he earned from transporting Lalo's bail money. Jimmy lies to Kim and says that he just got stuck in the desert. Kim obviously later discovers the coffee mug when Jimmy urges her to look at the $100K in the bag. The show itself draws attention to the mug's significance as Jimmy says that's what it's all about, referring to the money, although Kim is staring at the coffee mug with a bullet hole in it.
I see it.
That's what it's all about.
A great moment, in my opinion. So not only does the coffee mug in this sense come to represent Jimmy's status as a lawyer, but it also becomes the symbol of the lie that Jimmy tells to Kim about his time in the desert. It should be noted that just 2 episodes before Kim discovers the mug with the bullet hole in it, Jimmy promised that he wouldn't withhold information about his business from Kim. The mug therefore represents Jimmy's crooked nature as well as Kim's incapability of holding Jimmy accountable for these actions. It becomes even more fitting that in the first episode of season 6, Kim throws the coffee mug into the trash, representing that Jimmy's hopes of becoming a reputable lawyer have been all but lost. And that's not even the end of the motifs in Bagman. The bottle that Jimmy eventually drinks his own apple juice from is from Davis and Maine. The space blanket that he uses to lure the cartel thug is eerily similar to Chuck's space blankets. But we're getting ahead of ourselves.
I'm done.
Everything hurts. God, I'm so thirsty.
You need to drink.
What's the point? So they can find a corpse with a mouth full of piss?
That's not gonna happen.
After Jimmy and Mike ditch the car, we get into the crux of the episode. I love narratives that are about a group of characters being trapped in a single location with an outside force trying to game end them, and the protagonist coming up with creative solutions on how to survive. It's very similar to the 4 Days Out episode of Breaking Bad, in which Jesse and Walt become stuck in the desert because Jesse left the keys in the ignition of the RV. Other narratives that scratch this itch for me are The Thing, The Hateful Eight, and to some extent The Shining. You'll probably notice that I enjoy snow more than sand. Bagman also bears some resemblance to No Country for Old Men, at least in terms of the protagonist protecting a large sum of money from a killer that is hunting them, although this comparison is pretty thin considering how different the narratives are. Mike concludes that he and Jimmy need to get off-road so that they won't be found by the one cartel thug that escaped. The two start to walk into the desert, and it becomes swiftly apparent that Jimmy wasn't prepared for this task at all. Bagman does an incredible job in juxtaposing the differences between Jimmy and Mike. As we are in Mike's territory of the show, as opposed to a courtroom, he is wearing the appropriate attire for a trek through the desert. Meanwhile, Jimmy is in his suit and moccasins. In his arrogance, he didn't even bring a hat. The episode even foreshadows this arrogance by having Jimmy pour a bit of water on his moccasins to wash some dust off. Jimmy ponders about burying the money and coming back to it, but Mike notes that he will never be able to find it again. Meaning, even if Jimmy were to make it out of the desert alive without the money, he would surely be killed by one of Lalo's thugs. Worse yet, we also find out that Kim visits Lalo when Jimmy doesn't return home that night. This essentially means, at least for the audience, not for Jimmy per se, that if Jimmy doesn't return from the desert with the $7 million, Kim as well will be under threat. And that's where the possibilities of the series become interesting. We know that Jimmy isn't going to be game-ended during this episode, before the events of Breaking Bad, but we have no idea where Kim is during Breaking Bad. And at this point, where the odds are already stacked against Jimmy and Mike, the writers decided to make it even more difficult for the lawyer and the enforcer. As expected, the one cartel thug has begun searching for Jimmy and Mike, forcing them even deeper into the desert. This creates a brilliant ticking clock for the narrative. Not only are Jimmy and Mike going to die from heat exhaustion, but they have absolutely no means of dealing with the threat that looms over them. Furthermore, even Kim is now in danger, although Jimmy doesn't know this yet. The two decide to camp for the night. Mike has brought space blankets with him to conserve warmth. I really like that Jimmy refuses the space blanket because it reminds him so much of Chuck. It's another thing that the show does so well, as they don't really draw attention to this detail, but upon hindsight, you get why Jimmy refuses this space blanket. The two discuss Kim's involvement with Jimmy's business. Mike is surprised to find out that Jimmy has actually told Kim about his illegal activities. He says that because she knows she is in the game now. Jimmy likes to think that his illegal activities will only affect him in the long run. Whether he knows that Kim is also in danger is up to interpretation. Once again, my read is that he knows that Kim will also be in danger if he continues down this quote-unquote bad choice road, but he chooses to shove those feelings aside because he wants the cartel connection so bad. This interaction between Jimmy and Mike is also a clever way to foreshadow the next episode's confrontation with Lalo. The bad choice road will eventually put Kim in danger, no matter what Jimmy does. The next day, the two continue walking. It becomes readily apparent that they will run out of water soon. In his frustration, Jimmy decides to start dragging the bags instead of carrying them. Sometime later, Mike spots a $100 bill on the ground. The dragging has ripped a hole into the bottom of one of the duffel bags. Jimmy runs to grab the bills but accidentally kicks a cactus spine. Jimmy rips out the spine from his shoe and toe, obviously, and falls to the ground, admitting defeat. There isn't much to analyze in this sequence, but it is just very enjoyable to watch the screenwriters make a bad situation even worse. It's something that has become a staple of the Gilligan-verse. Place the characters into corners that seem inescapable and watch them come up with creative solutions about their escape. Mike approaches Jimmy and explains how he keeps going even when he is faced with tough situations.
I have people waiting for me. They don't know what I do. They never will. They're protected. But I do what I do so they can have a better life. And if I live or if I die, it really doesn't make a difference to me as long as they have what they need. So when it's my time to go, I will go knowing I did everything I could for them. Now you ask me how I keep going. That's how.
This moment reminds me a lot of the no half measures speech from Breaking Bad. Jonathan Banks is just so good at giving these old man lessons to protagonists who are in over their heads. In this moment, Mike spots the car again. Empowered by the speech, Jimmy now realizes what he must do. He gets up, adorns himself with Mike's space blanket, a highly reflective surface, and heads to the road. Mike takes out his sniper rifle and positions it towards the road. The cartel thug spots Jimmy and starts speeding towards him. This is a very tense moment, even though we know that Jimmy will survive this. I can't really explain why, but the way they shot it and the music just makes it so intense. Mike takes a shot and misses. The pressure rises. He focuses again. He takes the second shot. This time it hits the driver and the car flips to a total wreck. In a moment of dramatic irony, Mike approaches the car and notices the corpse of the driver. Next to him, a broken jug of water. All the water spilled. Jimmy faces down the road, opens the Davis & Maine water bottle, and drinks his own apple juice. He takes the bags and starts moving forward again. Mike follows him, stepping over the space blanket. And that's the end of the episode. Now, I have to admit that this ending seemed kinda abrupt to me the first time I watched the episode. My first impression back then was that, oh, they just had to shoot the driver with that sniper rifle that Mike had the whole time. It didn't seem like it was that outside the box, at least in comparison to Breaking Bad. Upon a rewatch, however, I've come to really like this solution to the problem. The way I see it is that Jimmy has been motivated by money this entire episode. He takes Lalo's job, he belittles Kim's worries, he wastes water, and in his obliviousness, almost gets game ended. He carries the bags across the desert in hopes to make money and eventually gives up. The motivation of the money isn't strong enough to carry him forward. What then becomes the motivation after Mike's speech about doing these jobs for his loved ones is Jimmy's love for Kim. This is where he chooses to knowingly put his life in danger, which is, I think, a first in this series. The risk of getting game ended for money isn't worth it. The risk of getting game ended to see Kim again is. It's a beautiful idea that the episode expresses without drawing too much attention to it. There's also the side of how Jimmy survives this encounter. As Alan Sepinwall put in his review for Rolling Stone, Jimmy does what he does best to get out of this problem. He scams and tricks the cartel thug. What makes it even better is the props that are used in this scene. The space blanket, the shiny reflective object that catches the thug's attention, is a callback to Jimmy's dead brother Chuck. Just moments ago, we saw Jimmy almost recoil at the sight of the space blanket. Here, however, he overcomes those negative memories and uses them to his advantage. The same can be said about the Davis & Maine water bottle that he drinks his apple juice from. Both of these objects link to Jimmy's past failures to stay on the straight and narrow, but at this moment, they essentially save him. It's a subtle way of showing how Jimmy's past has put him in this dangerous new territory, but with that experience, he can strive and survive this deadly encounter. It would be fitting if this was the moment where Jimmy stopped doing illegal stuff altogether, but that isn't the story. Even after this moment, and after Lalo's confrontation, he still returns to the crooked side of the law. Jimmy just can't help himself. I know that referring to Robert McKee's story is a bit cliche at this point, but this quote came to mind while watching this episode. True character is revealed in the choices a human being makes under pressure. The greater the pressure, the deeper the revelation. The truer the choice to the character's essential nature. The reason why Bagman is the best episode of Better Call Saul is because it reveals what kind of a person Jimmy McGill is to his core. Jimmy McGill's revelation through this episode is that he isn't willing to die for money. It's the idea of Kim that will carry him through this final confrontation in the desert. But what is even more fascinating about this essential nature of Jimmy is that once Kim leaves his life, the main motivating factor for him will once again become the money. And much later, the allure of the money will once again be replaced by his love for Kim.